The car door still shook after my own son slammed it on my arm without looking back. Still, I said nothing, just tugged my sleeve down over the bruise he never noticed. As the heater kicked in, he scrolled, too busy to see the mother beside him in pain. While his voice droned on about meetings, I remembered whose name owned the house he sat in. The same child I once carried now treated me like baggage. That's when I decided, if my son could slam a door on me, I could slam one on his inheritance. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The wind off the Bitterroot Mountains carried a bite that morning, a dry autumn chill that stung more than it soothed. Grace Halston tugged her coat tighter as she stepped out of the clinic, her discharge papers trembling faintly in her gloved hand. The parking lot shimmered with a thin glaze of frost, the kind that crackled underfoot. She spotted her son's SUV idling crookedly across two spaces. Nathan never could park straight when he was in a hurry. Through the windshield, she saw his face lit by the blue glow of his phone. His thumbs were moving fast. Grace hesitated on the curb, one hand pressed against her lower back where the doctor had prodded earlier, then started the slow walk toward him. He didn't look up until she was nearly at the passenger side. "Let's go, Mom. It's freezing," he muttered through the cracked window. "I'm coming," she said, steady but soft. Megan sat in the back seat, earbuds half in, hair tucked into her hoodie. She gave a small wave. The kind only grandchildren give when they're trying not to make things worse. Grace opened the door carefully, bracing her palm against the seat. The upholstery smelled faintly of fast food and cold air. She eased one leg in. The door swung in before she'd fully sat down. The edge caught her sleeve, then bit into the flesh of her forearm. A sharp gasp broke from her throat. Half shock, half pain. Nathan's eyes flicked up. "You all right?" His voice was flat, more reflex than concern. His phone buzzed again, and he went right back to it. Grace cradled her arm, rubbing at the tender spot beneath her coat. A thin red mark was already rising. She didn't answer. The door's thud still echoed in her chest. Megan leaned forward. "Dad, you shut it on her arm." Nathan huffed. "She should have moved faster." Grace stared out the window. The mountains in the distance were streaked with snow, sunlight slanting across them like a promise she couldn't quite reach. The car rolled forward with a jerk. Nathan adjusted the heater, muttering about traffic and schedules. The wipers scraped over a dry windshield. At the next stoplight, he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. "You said this appointment wouldn't take long." Grace swallowed. "The doctor wanted an X-ray." "That's why I hate these mid-morning things," he said, tone clipped. "Kills half my day." From the back seat, Megan whispered, "She's your mom." Nathan ignored her. Grace folded her hands in her lap, the ache in her arm pulsing in quiet rhythm with the turn signal. She thought of the boy he used to be, the one who brought her wildflowers from the yard, whose scraped knees she cleaned with warm water and patience. That boy had vanished somewhere between adolescence and ambition. They pulled into her driveway 10 minutes later. The house looked smaller than she remembered, dwarfed by the pines and the mountain shadow behind it. Nathan didn't bother to put the car fully in park before unlocking the doors. "Need help inside?" he asked, eyes still on the phone. "No," she said. The single syllable felt heavier than it should have. He shrugged. "Okay then. I've got a meeting." Megan's hand reached from the back seat, a quiet brush against Grace's shoulder. "I'll call you later, Grandma." Grace managed a small smile. "Thank you, sweetheart." She stepped out carefully, pulling the door shut herself this time. Slowly, deliberately. The slam from moments ago still echoed in her bones. Nathan revved the engine, half-waved, and backed out too fast, gravel spitting under the tires. The street fell silent except for the whisper of leaves skimming the pavement. Grace stood there, breath forming a pale cloud in the cold. She looked at the faint welt on her arm, the narrow line where skin had met metal. It wasn't the pain that struck her, it was the indifference. Inside, the house greeted her with stillness, the faint tick of the wall clock, the low hum of the refrigerator, the scent of the lavender cleaner she always used on Thursdays. She set her purse on the counter, removed her gloves, and stared at the faint smear of red on the cuff. Her mind replayed the moment in perfect clarity. The slam, the sting, the way he didn't even pause his texting. Respect, she'd always believed, wasn't something you asked for. It was something you either gave or didn't. She poured a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it. Then she set it down untouched. The clock ticked louder. Outside, the wind pushed through the porch screen, making it rattle like a whisper at the door. Grace turned toward the sound, her jaw tightening, a strange calm settling over her. Something in her had shifted, and when it did, it made a sound quieter than a slammed door, but it would echo far longer. The kettle began to whistle before Grace remembered she'd even set it on the stove. The sound pierced through the quiet house like something impatient, shrill, insistent, unwilling to wait for her to catch up. She turned off the burner and poured the steaming water over a chamomile bag, watching the color bloom in gentle spirals. The kitchen light flickered once, humming faintly, the way old fixtures do when they've seen too many seasons. She took her tea to the table by the window, the one that looked out over her narrow backyard where the birch trees were almost bare. The air smelled faintly of mint and the faintly metallic tang of cooling metal from the kettle. On the table sat a red folder, worn, edges curled, a faint coffee ring on its cover. The label, written in her own tidy script years ago, read, "Estate. Active." It had lived in the drawer under her phone charger for nearly a decade, untouched except for the occasional dusting. Tonight, it didn't stay closed. Grace set down her mug, took a deep breath, and pulled the folder toward her. The snap of the plastic fasteners echoed in the still room. Inside lay a neat stack of papers, old wills, notarized updates, copies of deeds, a few letters Lou Brenner had mailed her back when postage was still 50 cents. She flipped through until she reached the beneficiary page, her handwriting beside a name that once brought pride, now only fatigue. Nathan Halston. 100%. She stared at it, her reflection faint in the glossy paper. The steam from her mug curled between them like a ghost. For years, she had told herself fairness mattered more than feelings, that parents shouldn't punish with inheritance. But tonight, her arm throbbed where the car door had caught her. The faint red mark, now shadowed purple, pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her pen was on the table before she even realized she'd picked it up. She drew a slow line through his name. The ink didn't skip or hesitate. It glided, smooth, final. Then, below it, she wrote 2 words in her neat, slanted hand. Not anymore. The sound of her pen cap clicking shut felt louder than it should have. The clock above the sink ticked twice before her phone lit up on the counter. The message preview glowed pale blue. Megan. I'm sorry about earlier. I saw. Grace stared at the words for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she typed back, slowly, carefully. You're the only one who saw enough. She watched the 3 little dots blink, then vanish. Megan didn't respond. She didn't need to. Grace set the phone face down beside her tea, which had gone cold. She reached for it anyway, took a sip. It was bitter, but she swallowed it all the same. The chamomile left a faint dryness on her tongue, like dust on forgotten things. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, but this time it sounded different. Not like whispers, but like the low rustle of something rearranging itself. Grace leaned back in her chair. Her shoulders ached, but she didn't reach for the pain cream. She just sat, listening to the clock and her own breathing, feeling the odd steadiness in her chest. For 70 years she had been predictable, polite, organized, forgiving. She'd believed patience would earn her respect. But now, staring at the crossed-out name, she understood what the doctor had meant earlier that day when he'd said her bones were strong for her age. Strong didn't mean unbreakable. It meant they healed crooked if no one was careful. She closed the folder, pressed her palm to the cover, and slid it into the center of the table. Tomorrow, she would call Lou. She'd make everything official. No room for confusion, no chance for guilt to find its way back in. The porch light outside flickered once more before holding steady. The shadows along the kitchen wall stretched and softened. Grace lifted her mug again, drank what was left, and set it down with a soft clink. Somewhere in the silence, the refrigerator clicked on, a low hum filling the space. It sounded almost like approval. She looked toward the front door, the one her son had closed so carelessly just hours ago. The latch gleamed in the dim light. Then she whispered to no one at all. Doors can close both ways. And in that moment, she knew. Tomorrow's phone call wouldn't be about forgiveness. It would be about finality. The sky over Missoula the next morning was a dull pewter, the kind that made everything look colder than it was. Grace drove herself downtown, heater on low, a paper cup of coffee cooling in the console. The roads were quiet. Just a few trucks heading toward the lumberyard and the distant hum of traffic rolling down Higgins Avenue. Her arm still ached, a faint bruise hidden beneath the sleeve of her wool coat. She flexed her hand at every stoplight, the way the doctor had shown her to ease stiffness. It wasn't the kind of pain that begged for sympathy. It was the kind that demanded a decision. Lou Brenner's office sat on the second floor of a brick building tucked between a credit union and a barber shop. She had been coming here for decades, for the house deed when her husband died, for the insurance revisions, for everything that mattered. Today would matter most. The bell over the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The warmth hit her cheeks, bringing a faint pink to the pale skin that Montana winters never spared. Lou's receptionist, a woman with sharp glasses and a softer smile, looked up. "Morning, Mrs. Halston. Lou's just finishing a call." "I'll wait," Grace said, easing herself into the chair by the window. She watched the snow beginning to drift past the glass, tiny flakes that never seemed to land anywhere for long. A few minutes later, Lou appeared from his office, tie slightly crooked, expression as practical as always. "Grace," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "Something serious?" She stood, smoothing her coat, and handed him the red folder she'd carried against her chest the whole drive. "You could say that." Lou's eyebrows lifted as he gestured her into his office. It was lined with old law books and faintly smelled of lemon polish and paper. The blinds were half drawn, letting in a muted light that made everything look deliberate. He motioned to the chair across from his desk. "All right, what's got you walking in with that face?" Grace sat down, laying the folder squarely in front of him. She opened it just enough to pull out one document, the will she had last signed 5 years ago. She didn't flinch as she slid it across the desk. "I want him removed, fully." Lou leaned back, studying her for a moment. "Nathan?" Grace nodded once. "He's out. Every account, every policy, every clause. If my name's on it, his won't be." Lou exhaled through his nose, tapping his pen against the desk blotter. "That's not a small change, Grace. You sure?" "Completely." He gave a small grunt that wasn't quite disapproval, just recognition. "All right then, I'll make it ironclad. Who gets what now?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the frosted window. "Megan. Every last thing." Then, after a pause that carried more weight than any sigh, she added, "With a clause." Lou tilted his head. "A clause?" "She has to earn it. A year of college or a trade program. Something with purpose." Lou nodded slowly, jotting notes on a legal pad. That's fair. You've always liked your terms clear. Grace allowed herself a faint smile. I've learned clarity prevents grief later. He looked up at her, studying her expression. The kind of look only old friends can give, where sympathy and respect meet somewhere in the middle. I won't ask what brought this on, but I will say, I've never seen you this certain. I've spent too long mistaking patience for love, Grace said quietly. Turns out, one doesn't guarantee the other. Lou's pen froze mid-stroke. For a brief second, the office was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then he signed a tab on his notes, brisk and final. All right, we'll start today. I'll draft the revisions and send them for your review by tomorrow evening. Want me to include the power of attorney adjustments too? Every single one. He nodded. Done. Grace leaned forward, folding her hands. Lou, when it's ready, I want it notarized immediately. No room for interference. Consider it handled. The heater kicked on with a low hum, stirring the papers on his desk. Grace watched the edges flutter, her mind quiet for the first time in years. Lou looked at her over the top of his glasses. You know, you always said your son was a lot like his father. Grace's jaw tightened just slightly. Yes. But his father learned respect before it was too late. Lou didn't reply. He just nodded once, slow and solemn, as if he understood more than he was willing to say aloud. Grace rose, buttoning her coat. Send me the papers when they're ready. Will do, he said. And Grace, whatever this is, make sure it brings you peace. She gave him a look that wasn't quite a smile. Oh, it will. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying dry leaves across the parking lot. Grace paused beside her car, watching them spiral, scatter, and vanish. She thought of doors, how they could shut, how they could seal. When she unlocked her car, she noticed a small smudge of ink on her thumb from the wheel she'd touched. She rubbed it clean with a tissue, then held her hand up to the light. Steady. Certain. Her phone buzzed inside her purse. A new message. Nathan, you home? Need to talk money later. Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't open it. She turned the key in the ignition, and as the engine came alive, she whispered, so softly it almost vanished into the hum of the heater. Too late for talking. And then she pulled out of the lot, leaving nothing unfinished except the signature that would soon end everything. The morning light outside the Missoula Credit Union looked thinner than usual, washed pale against the glass doors. Grace stood there for a moment before stepping inside, her reflection ghosting back at her. Coat buttoned, hair neatly pinned, the red folder tucked firmly under one arm. The warmth of the lobby met her like an old quilt, comfortable but impersonal. The air smelled faintly of paper and sanitizer, of pens chained to counters and coffee sipped between transactions. The same silver clock above the teller windows had been there for as long as she could remember. Ellie Coates was at her desk near the window, glasses perched low on her nose, flipping through loan paperwork with the quiet precision of someone who took pride in getting every number right. When she looked up and saw Grace, her face softened immediately. Well, if it isn't my favorite early bird, Ellie said, pushing her chair back. You've still got that winter stride, determined as ever. Grace managed a small smile. Determined fits? Ellie's gaze flicked to the folder under Grace's arm. That looks serious. It is, Grace replied, voice even. Do you have a few minutes? For you. Always? Ellie waved her toward the small consultation desk near the glass wall overlooking the parking lot. What can I do for you today? Grace laid the folder on the table but didn't open it. I need to make a change to my savings account. All right. Ellie reached for her keyboard. What kind of change? I want to remove joint access. Ellie's hands paused mid-type. Nathan's name? Grace nodded once. The air between them stilled for a moment, filled only by the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Ellie leaned back, studying Grace's face the way a friend studies a clock that suddenly stopped ticking. "That's something we can do immediately," she said gently. "Are you sure you want to?" "Completely sure." Ellie gave a small nod, not pressing further. "All right then." She turned the monitor slightly so Grace could see. "This is the authorization page. You'll sign here, and his access will be revoked before he even realizes it." Grace took the offered pen, her fingers steady. The ballpoint glided across the paper, leaving her signature, neat, practiced, final. She handed the pen back. "Let him wonder," she murmured. Ellie blinked, then gave a knowing smile. "I take it you're not in the mood to explain it to him." "No," Grace said simply. "Explaining hasn't done much good lately." Ellie printed out confirmation papers, slid them neatly into a manila envelope, and handed it over. "There, you're the only one with access now. Clean break." Grace tucked the envelope into her folder. "Thank you." "Of course," Ellie said. "You've always kept things tidy. It suits you." As she turned to leave, Ellie stopped her with a soft, "Wait." She opened a drawer, pulled out a new checkbook, and slid it across the counter. "This is linked to your updated account. Fresh start." Grace ran her fingertips across the smooth cover, deep forest green with her name embossed in gold. It caught the light when she lifted it. "You always did have good taste in colors," she said. Ellie smiled faintly. "Habit of the trade. We notice what holds value." Grace's eyes flicked up. "So do I." For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two women who had seen too many quiet betrayals dressed up as family business. Then Ellie asked, softly but without pity, "Need anything else while you're here?" Grace thought for a moment. "No, not here." "Then you're all set." Grace gathered her things, stood, and adjusted her scarf. As she walked toward the exit, she caught sight of her reflection again in the glass, steadier this time, almost taller. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering the last of the yellow leaves across the asphalt. She walked to her car slowly, watching one leaf plaster itself against her windshield before slipping away in the gust. She sat for a moment before turning the key. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, a notification lighting up the screen. "Nathan, saw something weird on my account. You changed something?" Grace stared at the message for a long beat, the faint hum of the engine filling the car. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then tapped, "Delete." The notification vanished. She looked out toward the mountains, their edges sharp against the pale sky. For the first time in years, she felt something close to satisfaction. Not joy, not even relief, but a quiet steadiness that felt earned. She reached into her bag, touched the red folder, then the new checkbook resting beside it. The gold lettering gleamed in the thin sunlight. "Not yours anymore," she whispered to the empty seat. A gust of wind hit the car door, rattling it in its frame, one last echo of the slam that had started everything. Grace tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Then, with a calm that felt almost dangerous, she pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the attorney's office, because one account was closed, and the rest of her life was about to follow. The clouds had thickened by the time Grace turned into her driveway. The light had gone the color of old pewter again, the same color as the morning she'd signed away Nathan's access at the bank. The house waited in silence, trimmed in brittle ivy, porch light still on from the night before. It was the kind of quiet that held its breath. Grace shut off the engine and sat for a moment, the ticking of the cooling car loud in the still air. Across the street, a neighbor's dog barked once and then went silent. She looked at the red folder on the passenger seat, then at her house key hanging from its familiar blue fob, its grooves worn smooth by decades of repetition. She stepped out and felt the cold bite at her cheeks. Her boots crunched across the gravel as she crossed to the mailbox. The lock was stiff from disuse. Nathan had fetched the mail often in recent years, when he bothered to. She'd let him keep a spare key, tucked in the little brass box labeled Post on his keychain. Not anymore. Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope she'd picked up from the hardware store on her way home. Inside, a new lock cylinder and two bright silver keys that gleamed like promise. She fit the screwdriver into the old slot, metal squealing softly as she worked. When the new lock clicked into place, she slipped one key onto her own ring and set the spare on the kitchen counter inside. A sound of finality, small but precise. From there, she moved to the porch. The boards creaked beneath her as she knelt by the corner post. For years, she'd kept an emergency key taped to the underside, a habit that once felt practical, comforting even. She'd told Nathan about it when he was still in college. "Just in case, sweetheart. You never know when you'll need to come by." He had used it more times than she could count. Grace slid her fingers beneath the porch rail until she found the bit of old tape, frayed at the edges, dust gathering along it. The metal underneath was cold. She peeled the tape loose, holding the key up in the thin light filtering through the clouds. "Not anymore," she whispered. She walked inside, opened her kitchen drawer, and dropped the key into the trash with a soft clink. Then she wiped her hands on a dish towel, as if scrubbing away the last trace of sentiment. The final step waited in the garage. Her husband had installed the keypad system 15 years ago, a simple 4-digit code Nathan had insisted she keep unchanged, so he could help out any time. The keypad was dusty, faintly glowing green in the half-light. Grace pressed the buttons to access the programming menu, fingers steady, movements deliberate. A few minutes later, the old code was gone. In its place, she entered 4 numbers that meant something only to her, the date she'd married her late husband, back when promises had weight. The keypad beeped once. Secure. Grace exhaled, a small, satisfied sound. Her phone buzzed from the counter behind her. She glanced at the screen. "Amanda, did you change the lock?" "Nathan's key isn't working." Grace stared at the text, thumb hovering for a long second before she typed. "Correct." A pause. Then another message popped up. "You're being petty." Grace smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She typed one word back. "Maybe." She set the phone down beside the sink and looked out through the kitchen window. The yard was still, the trees bare now except for a few stubborn brown leaves clinging to the high branches. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, followed by the hollow sound of something metallic shifting on the porch, probably the empty flower pot Nathan had kicked over last month. She turned away from the glass and poured herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. The first sip burned, but she didn't flinch. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. "Nathan's furious. Says you're overreacting." Grace took another slow sip, then replied, "Then he's finally reacting." She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she went to her desk and opened the red folder, checking each new document: account changes, legal drafts, witness forms. Everything was falling into place. Lou would have the final will ready tomorrow. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a soft groan from the porch beams. Grace listened to it the way others might listen to a hymn, the sound of a house tightening itself against the cold. She stood, walked to the front door and turned the lock twice, once to test it, and once more for assurance. Her reflection in the brass handle was warped, but steady. There was power in closing things, power in sealing what no longer served you. Her phone lit up again across the counter, vibrating against the surface. Grace didn't move to answer. The screen dimmed, then went dark, leaving her alone with the quiet tick of the kitchen clock. She looked toward the door one last time and whispered, "You can keep knocking, Then she turned off the lights. The house settled around her, locked tight. Every door and gate and code changed. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like ownership. Grace heard the car long before she saw it. The growl of Nathan's engine up the quiet street broke through the calm like a bad memory clawing its way back. She'd been pruning the dead stems from her porch plants, hands steady, breath slow in the cold morning air. The vehicle came to a hard stop in front of her house. Too fast, too loud. Gravel spat against the curb. The engine cut off, leaving a silence that felt almost heavier than the sound. Amanda was the first out of the car, coat half-buttoned, sunglasses perched on her head, though the sky was gray. Nathan followed, jaw set, keys jingling in his hand as if he needed the noise to keep from shouting. Grace straightened, resting the pruning shears on the porch rail. "Morning," she said evenly. "Don't morning me," Nathan snapped, coming up the steps. "What the hell's going on, Mom? Ellie said you pulled me off your account." Grace cut in before he could finish. "I did." He blinked, taken aback by the calmness of her tone. "You can't just... You're seriously cutting me out?" Grace tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but precise. "You cut me first." Nathan's face flushed, confusion giving way to anger. "Cut you first? What does that even mean?" Amanda folded her arms, standing beside him like an impatient spectator. "Grace, honestly, this is ridiculous. Changing locks, bank accounts, passwords. Don't you think you're being a little dramatic?" Grace's eyes narrowed just slightly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She lifted her sleeve instead, revealing the faint bruise still shadowing her forearm. "This," she said softly, "was dramatic." For a moment, no one spoke. The cold air seemed to still between them. Amanda's eyes flicked to the mark, then quickly away, as if pretending not to see could make it less real. Nathan's jaw worked, his mouth opening, closing. "I didn't mean... Mom, that was an accident," he said finally. "You know I didn't mean anything by it." Grace's voice didn't waver. "You didn't even look up." Nathan threw up his hands. "So that's it? You're disinheriting me over a door?" "It wasn't the door," Grace replied, her tone sharpening just a fraction. "It was the moment I realized you'd stopped seeing me." Amanda let out a dry laugh, short and sharp. "You're talking like some melodrama. Nathan's been running himself ragged helping you." "Helping himself," Grace interrupted, eyes locked on Amanda's. "To my accounts, to my patience, to my time." Amanda's voice rose. "You're being paranoid. Everyone your age gets like this when they start to..." "Finish that sentence carefully," Grace warned. Amanda stopped, lips parting but no sound coming out. Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice as though proximity might soften his words. "Mom, you're overreacting. If you were upset, you could have talked to me instead of pulling this legal stunt." Grace met his gaze steadily. "You had 42 years to talk, Nathan. You chose to text." Amanda sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "This is pointless. She's made up her mind." Grace turned to her. "Correct." Amanda's expression flickered, something between irritation and disbelief. "You're going to regret this when you realize you've alienated your own son." Grace smiled faintly. "My son alienated himself." Before Amanda could respond, the creak of another car door cut through the tension. All three turned toward the street. Megan stepped out of her small sedan, backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in her hand. "Grandma," she called, walking quickly toward the porch. Her eyes flicked from Nathan's stiff posture to Amanda's tight expression. "What's going on?" Nathan's voice came low, defensive. "We're trying to talk some sense into your grandmother." Megan stopped at the bottom step, glancing between them. "Or are you trying to talk her out of something she already decided?" Amanda's jaw clenched. Megan, stay out of this. But the girl didn't move. Instead, she climbed the steps and stood beside Grace, her hand brushing her grandmother's arm lightly, right where the bruise had faded to pale yellow. Grace didn't look at her, but her shoulders eased just slightly. Nathan looked from one to the other, disbelief settling over his face. You're siding with her? You don't even understand what she's doing. I understand perfectly, Megan said. You hurt her, Dad. Nathan's voice cracked into a bitter laugh. Everyone's acting like I ran her over with the car. It was an accident. An accident, Grace said softly. You never apologized for. Silence. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying only the faint rustle of the birch branches above. Amanda adjusted her sunglasses, her composure starting to crack. This is absurd. Nathan, get in the car. Let her play her little power game. Grace's eyes didn't leave her son's. You always wanted control, Nathan. You finally taught me how to take it. He stared at her for a long moment, something like disbelief flickering into hurt, then into anger again. He turned abruptly, muttering something under his breath as he stalked back down the steps. Amanda followed, slamming the car door harder than necessary. The engine roared to life and peeled away from the curb, leaving behind the sharp scent of exhaust and resentment. Grace stayed on the porch, the pruning shears still resting where she'd left them. The silence returned, slow and deliberate. Megan exhaled beside her. That was a lot. Grace nodded once, still staring at the empty street. It needed to happen. Megan looked up at her. Are you okay? Grace's lips curved into something small but sure. I'm getting there. Megan squeezed her arm gently, and for the first time all morning, Grace felt the cold ease from her bones. The porch light flickered once, catching both of their reflections in the window. Two faces side by side, one softened by youth, the other by decision. From somewhere deep in the house came the faint buzz of Grace's phone on the counter. She didn't move to check it. Whatever message waited there could wait forever. The letter arrived folded crookedly in a cheap white envelope, the kind bulk firms use when they're paid by the hour and not by the heart. Grace found it in her mailbox on a Wednesday morning, wedged between grocery flyers and a heating company coupon. The return address made her lips curl slightly. Troy and Matthews Legal Services, a discount firm off Reserve Street known for handling divorce settlements and small claims squabbles. She didn't need to open it to know who'd sent them. Still, she slit the edge cleanly with her kitchen knife, unfolded the pages, and read the formal nonsense aloud under her breath. This letter serves to inform you that Nathan Halston has retained legal counsel regarding recent modifications to your estate planning and beneficiary designations. She almost laughed. Estate planning, as if it were a mistake she'd made with her checkbook. When she reached Lou's office an hour later, the papers sat neatly on top of the red folder she'd carried through every decision. Lou greeted her with his usual slow smile, though his eyes showed he'd already guessed what was inside. Let me guess, he said, taking the pages from her hand. They hired the cheapest lawyer in town. Grace nodded. He's predictable if nothing else. Lou skimmed the letter, then leaned back in his chair with a low chuckle. This firm tried to contest a will for one of my clients last spring. They sent their intern to court because the lead attorney wasn't available. The judge made it last 8 minutes. Grace raised an eyebrow. Let's make this one shorter? He grinned, pulling a file drawer open. Already ahead of you. From the drawer, Lou extracted a thick binder, tabbed, dated, color-coded. This, he said, dropping it on the desk with a satisfying thump, is 34 pages of timestamps, witness statements, and notarized copies of every document you've signed since 2012. Grace couldn't help the faint smile tugging at her lips. I prepared that folder in 2012, she said, tapping the red cover resting in her lap. I just finally used it. Lou nodded appreciatively. That's the difference between planning and revenge, Grace. One's emotional, the other's airtight. He started printing a cover letter, his printer humming in the corner. I'll send them this. Every page, every signature, and the audio recording from your last meeting here. They'll fold by Friday. Grace folded her hands on her lap, calm but focused. He'll take it personally. Oh, I hope so, Lou muttered, signing his name with a flourish. People like your son only understand boundaries when they hit them head on. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, the lamplight warm against the windows. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Megan. Mom's been calling me all day. She says you're ruining the family. Grace's thumb hovered over the keyboard. You're not responsible for fixing anyone, she typed back. Megan replied almost instantly. She says Dad's lawyer can reverse everything. She's lying, right? Grace smiled faintly. Lou says they have no legal ground to stand on. Then, after a pause, she added, Stand where you feel safe, Megan. It took a full minute before Megan's next message came through. I blocked her number. Grace exhaled, a slow release that carried years of swallowed restraint. Outside, the wind was pushing hard against the house again, but tonight it didn't sound like resistance. It sounded like movement, like something finally shifting to where it belonged. 2 days later, Lou called her at noon sharp. His tone was brisk but laced with satisfaction. They folded, he said. Didn't even make it to formal review. Their attorney faxed over a withdrawal notice this morning, claimed it was all a misunderstanding. Grace set down her mug of coffee, watching the steam twist upward. It was. Their misunderstanding that I'd stay quiet. Lou chuckled. You're something, Grace. Most people at your age want peace. You went and built it yourself. She smiled softly. Peace doesn't arrive. It's installed. Like a lock. Then I'd say yours is double-bolted. When they hung up, Grace stayed seated, hands cupped around her coffee. The red folder lay open on the table beside her, its contents in perfect order. Her phone buzzed once more, an incoming message from an unknown number. She recognized the clipped phrasing even before reading it aloud. This isn't over. Grace stared at it for a long moment. Then she typed her reply, slow and deliberate. You're right. It's not. I'm just ahead. She hit send, set the phone face down, and leaned back in her chair. Through the window, a single leaf pressed against the glass, clinging there for a heartbeat before sliding down and disappearing. Grace watched it fall and whispered, and that's how things end. But even as she said it, she knew things weren't ending yet. They were only tightening. The morning broke wide and empty, the kind of silence that feels earned. No messages, no footsteps, just frost feathering across the windows and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Grace stood at her kitchen counter with her travel mug, watching the steam curl against the window pane. She'd spent days sealing doors, cutting ties, drawing the borders of her life sharper. Now, for the first time, there was nothing left to fix or sign or lock. There was only the quiet. She slipped on her coat, grabbed her keys, and stepped outside. The air smelled clean and sharp, carrying the faint tang of pine from the hills. Her car sat where it always did, pale blue and loyal, dusted with the ghost of last night's frost. When she turned the key, the engine came alive on the first try, a small, faithful sound that belonged entirely to her. Grace pulled onto the road, the tires crunching over gravel before finding the smooth hum of the highway. The town shrank in her rearview mirror. The gas station with its flickering sign, the diner with the closed blinds, the faint steeple that caught every bit of morning light. The hills rose ahead like a slow breath, gray-green and sleeping under their quilt of mist. She drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her lap, steady and sure. For the first time in months, maybe years, There were no voices filling the car. No Nathan sighing from the driver's seat. No Amanda making sharp little remarks from the back. No phone buzzing with guilt disguised as concern. Just wind. The sound wrapped around her like a kind of freedom, crisp and endless. Half an hour later, she reached the overlook, a curved pull-off lined with wooden rails and a single picnic bench, faded from years of sun and snow. The valley below was a slow sprawl of fields, gold and copper under the low light. The mountains rose behind them, distant but solid, as if they'd been waiting for her to look up. Grace turned off the engine. The silence that followed was total. She sat there, letting the warmth from the heater fade. Then she reached into her coat pocket, found the small pad of sticky notes she kept for grocery lists, and peeled one off. Her pen moved across the yellow square, the ink thick and sure. Still mine. She pressed the note onto the dashboard, smoothing the edge with her fingertip. It felt almost ceremonial. Her phone buzzed softly against the console. A text from Megan. "I hope you're somewhere peaceful." Grace smiled, the kind that started in the chest and worked its way up. Small, but real. She rolled down the window just enough to let the cold air in, filling her lungs until it almost stung. The sky smelled like rain that hadn't yet fallen. She picked up her phone, angled it toward the view, and snapped a photo, the mountains stretching forever, their edges softened by mist. Then she sent it with no caption. A moment later, the read receipt appeared. 3 dots blinked, then vanished. Grace slipped the phone back into her coat pocket, leaned back in her seat, and closed her eyes. The engine ticked quietly, cooling. Her thoughts wandered, to her husband's laugh, to the first time Nathan had learned to drive on this very road, to the version of herself who'd once waited for others to do the right thing. That woman felt distant now, fading like the fog in the valley. The wind picked up, brushing the edge of her scarf against her cheek. She reached for the steering wheel, tracing the curve of it like an old friend's face. "You were here before him," she murmured to the car. "You'll be here after." It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. She stayed until the sun climbed high enough to turn the frost on the guardrail into a line of diamonds. Then she started the engine again, the sticky note glowing yellow in the light. As she turned back toward town, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back wasn't angry anymore. She was something stronger, quietly certain. Halfway down the winding road, her phone buzzed again from the seat beside her. Another message preview flashed briefly on the screen. "Nathan." Just a few words. "You think this makes you free?" Grace didn't touch it. She let the message fade into darkness as the road curved downward, the mountains rising behind her like witnesses. "Freedom," she said aloud, eyes on the open stretch ahead, "isn't given." She pressed her foot on the gas, steady and sure. "It's taken." The sky over downtown Missoula hung low and pale, the kind of overcast that made everything look washed clean. Grace parked outside Lou's office, the same space she'd used for 20 years, and turned off the engine. The sticky note from her drive still clung to the dashboard, its corners curled but its message firm. "Still mine." She ran her thumb over it once, then gathered her red folder, slipped on her gloves, and stepped into the chill. Inside the office, Lou was already waiting, standing by the window with a stack of neatly bound documents in one hand and a steaming mug of black coffee in the other. "Morning," he said, voice low and steady. "Got everything ready for you." Grace closed the door behind her, the latch clicking with the precision of a gavel. "Let's make it official." Lou motioned her toward the conference table where the papers waited in perfect order. Each page bore her name in crisp print, Grace Halston. "These," he said, sliding the first few pages toward her, "revoke Nathan's power of attorney, financial and medical. From here on, only you and your chosen executor can make decisions." Grace nodded, taking the pen. The weight of it felt right. Heavier than a ballpoint, lighter than regret. She signed her name on the first line, her handwriting steady. The ink shone wet under the light. Lou turned to the next document. Updated estate plan. Every retirement account, every savings bond, every bit of real property. You wanted Megan listed as sole beneficiary? Yes. He nodded approvingly. There's a clause too. You can read it, but I think you'll like how we phrased it. Grace adjusted her glasses and scanned the paragraph near the bottom. All assets to be transferred in full to Megan Halston upon completion of 1 year of post-secondary education, accredited trade certification, or equivalent documented program. At the margin, in Lou's tidy handwriting, he'd added the note she'd asked for. Earned, not handed. Grace let out a quiet breath. Perfect. Lou smiled faintly. You've made this as ironclad as any I've ever written. He could hire 10 lawyers. It wouldn't matter. He's already tried, Grace said dryly. Didn't go well. Lou chuckled, then reached for the final sheet. This one's for notarization. You sign, I stamp, and that's that. Grace leaned forward, her pen gliding one last time across the thick paper. The tip scratched softly, a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Lou flipped the notary seal open, pressed it against the document, and stamped it with a firm, satisfying click. There, he said, the line that shuts every door behind you. Grace met his eyes. Good. He slid the signed packet into a manila envelope and wrote final copy across the front. You'll get the certified duplicates next week. I'll keep mine on file, locked. Of course. Grace stood, buttoning her coat. You always did like a clean ending. Only when it's deserved, Lou replied. By the end of the week, the clean ending was tested. Amanda showed up at the credit union with a printed complaint form in hand, her voice sharp enough to draw stares from 2 tellers. My husband's mother is being manipulated, she told the manager. She's changing her will and doesn't have the mental capacity for these decisions. Ellie Coates was at her desk when she heard the commotion. She rose quietly, adjusted her blazer, and walked to the counter. Mrs. Halston? She said evenly. I can help you with that. Amanda blinked, caught off guard. Yes, you know Grace, right? You've seen her recently? I have, Ellie said. She came in last week, removed your husband from her joint account, authorized her own transactions, and confirmed her identity without assistance. Amanda's posture wavered slightly. Well, she's been erratic. My husband's just trying to protect her. Ellie folded her hands. Protect her from what? Making her own choices? Amanda flushed. You're not qualified to make that determination. Actually, Ellie replied, tone still calm, I am qualified to provide a witness statement, which I've already done for her attorney. Amanda's mouth opened, then closed again. Ellie's smile was polite, not warm. If you'd like to pursue your claim, you can mail it directly to the attorney on record, Lou Brenner, downtown Missoula. But I should warn you, he doesn't lose cases. Amanda left without finishing her sentence, the form still clutched in her hand. That evening, Grace sat by her fireplace, the red folder closed beside her. She had only one copy of the new plan at home, sealed in a plastic sleeve. Her tea sat cooling on the coffee table. Her phone buzzed once. Megan, Mom's furious, says she's going to make things right. Grace typed back, slow and sure. Things are right, Megan. Finally. The clock ticked on the mantel, marking a rhythm she hadn't noticed before, a quiet pulse of ownership. She set her phone down, leaned back, and watched the flames lick higher. Outside, the wind carried faint snow against the windows, each flake catching in the light before vanishing. She reached for her pen and wrote a single note on the back of an envelope. When the time comes, Lou has every signature. Don't worry. Then she tucked it under the red folder and turned her gaze back to the fire. Behind her, the phone buzzed again. Unknown number. The message preview glowed cold and simple. You'll regret this. Grace didn't open it. She only whispered into the room's soft crackle. I regret nothing signed in ink. The fire popped once, bright and final. And outside, the snow kept falling. Steady, sealing everything she'd just made irrevocable. The snow from the night before still clung to the roofs and tree branches, softening the sharp edges of Missoula's morning. By evening, it had settled into a muted calm, the kind that hushes every sound before it can reach the window. Grace sat at her kitchen table with a single plate before her. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, leftovers she'd reheated more out of habit than hunger. The clock ticked softly above her, marking the rhythm of a house at rest. No raised voices, no phone vibrating across the counter, no son pacing the porch. Just stillness. She ate slowly, the scrape of her fork the only sound. Once, this quiet would have unnerved her. It used to sound like absence. Tonight, it sounded like ownership. When her plate was empty, she rinsed it, dried it, and slid it neatly into the cabinet. Her movements were measured, almost ceremonial. She turned on the lamp in the living room and took her knitting from the basket by the couch. The yarn unwound smoothly between her fingers, soft gray wool, the color of winter clouds. She worked one row, then another. Each loop held the weight of years she'd spent talking to people who never really listened. Her phone buzzed once on the side table, a voicemail notification. She glanced at the screen. Amanda. Grace didn't move to open it, but the machine's light blinked, insistent and red. She set the knitting aside and pressed play, just long enough to hear Amanda's voice, clipped and quivering beneath the practiced composure. Grace, this isn't you. You're letting people get in your head. Nathan's hurt. We all are. You're acting like we don't love you, but we do. You're just making things worse for everyone. A pause. Then quieter. Sweeter. False as syrup. Call me back. Before it's too late. Grace pressed delete without hesitation. The message vanished, the red light blinked out, and the room fell still again. She picked up her knitting, worked another row, then stopped. The house seemed to breathe around her. The slow hum of the heater, the faint creak of the settling wood. It was peaceful. Yes. But peace, she thought, always comes dressed in quiet that others mistake for loneliness. She looked toward the front door, where her coat hung by the window. Snow glittered faintly beyond the glass, reflecting the porch light she always left on. For no one. For herself. The sound of tires crunching on snow pulled her from her thoughts. Headlights swept briefly across the living room walls. Grace stood, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. A moment later came a knock. 2 quick taps, polite and light. Grace opened the door to find Megan standing there, cheeks pink from the cold, a foil-covered pie tin balanced in her gloved hands. Hi, Grandma. Grace's lips softened into a real smile. Hi, sweetheart. Come in before you freeze. Megan stepped inside, brushing snow from her boots. I brought cherry. Thought you might want dessert. Grace lifted the edge of the foil, inhaling the faint smell of sugar and spice. Looks perfect. They sat at the table. The pie still warm enough to fog the knife blade. Grace poured 2 cups of tea. Neither of them spoke much. Just small murmurs about school, the weather, a new teacher Megan didn't like. But when Megan set her fork down, her expression turned serious. Mom's been trying to get me to talk to Dad. She said you'll come around eventually. Grace met her eyes, calm but firm. She's wrong. Megan nodded slowly, almost relieved. That's what I told her. Grace reached across the table, resting her hand over Megan's. You don't have to take sides. You just have to see clearly. I do, Megan said softly. I see who actually shows up. For a long moment, neither moved. The lamplight painted both their faces in amber, the young one bright with resolve, the older one lined with something steadier than anger. Megan leaned back in her chair, exhaling. It's just us now, huh? Grace looked toward the window where the snow had begun to fall again, slow, deliberate flakes drifting through the porch light. She squeezed Megan's hand gently. Just us, she said. And that's enough. They finished their pie in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Later, after Megan left, Grace stood by the door watching her car taillights fade down the street. The snow kept falling, covering the tire tracks almost as soon as they were made. She closed the door, locked it once, then twice. When she turned off the lamp, the reflection of the empty house stared back from the window. Warm, orderly, alive. And though others might have called it loneliness, Grace finally understood what it truly was. Peace with no witnesses. She whispered it aloud, testing the weight of it. Mine. But as she turned toward the hallway, her phone buzzed again on the counter. A low hum that refused to stop. This time, it wasn't Amanda. The caller ID read, "Private number." Grace's hand hovered over it, the glow of the screen painting her face in pale light. Then the phone stopped ringing. The house fell silent once more. And in that silence, something in her chest, some instinct, stirred just enough to remind her, peace never lasts without a fight to defend it. The first Saturday of spring thaw came early that year. By dusk, Missoula's air had turned soft, wet with the promise of new grass, the snow retreating in quiet surrender along the curbs. Grace stood on her porch, hanging the last of the string lights she'd dug from a box labeled Christmas, maybe next year. This year had become next year. Inside, the table was set for 5, a roast chicken, bowls of buttered carrots, cornbread, and the lemon pie Megan had insisted on baking. A vase of daffodils from the grocery store stood in the center, their yellow petals the brightest thing in the room. When the doorbell rang, the sound was cheerful, unhurried. Ellie Coates was first, bundled in a green coat, cheeks pink from the cold. Behind her came 2 of Grace's old neighbors, and last, Lou Brenner, holding something wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "Smells better than half the restaurants in town," Lou said as he stepped in, stamping snow from his shoes. "And that's coming from a man who eats too many meals alone." "Then you'll fit right in," Grace said, smiling as she took his coat. The evening moved easily. Laughter rose and fell, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the scratch of chair legs against old wood floors. Grace poured wine, her hands steady. No one brought up Nathan or Amanda or any of the noise that used to fill her phone. When the plates were cleared, Lou placed the brown paper package in front of her. "Before dessert," he said, "something to mark the occasion." Grace untied the twine. Inside was a bound copy of her finalized estate plan. Black cover, her name embossed in silver across the front. She looked up, surprised. "You didn't have to make it look so elegant." "I did," Lou said. "It's the cleanest case I've ever filed, and it's yours, start to finish." Ellie raised her glass. "To clean endings." Grace shook her head lightly, eyes warm. "To beginnings that don't ask permission." The table hummed with soft laughter. Megan, seated beside her, lifted her phone. "Smile, Grandma. This is your celebration." Grace turned toward the lens, the porch light catching the fine lines on her face, turning them into something radiant. Megan clicked the photo, the image of a woman surrounded not by family obligation, but by chosen company. Lou leaned back in his chair, watching her with quiet satisfaction. You've got nothing left to fear now, Grace. She met his eyes. I don't, she said. Not a thing. For a moment, that was the truth of the room. Warmth, laughter, the comfortable buzz of people who'd earned each other's company. The air smelled of roasted herbs and candle wax. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's wind chime caught the breeze. Later, after everyone had gone and the dishes were stacked neatly by the sink, Grace stepped onto the porch alone. The string lights glowed against the dark like a constellation only she could name. Megan's photo had already been posted on her private feed, a simple caption beneath it. She looks happy. Grace didn't see it right away, but Amanda did. An hour later, on Amanda's own page, a new post appeared. The photo wasn't there. Only words, tight and bitter. Some mothers just don't appreciate what they had. Within minutes, the comments began. Friends offering sympathy, distant relatives typing small hearts or shaking head emojis. The post gathered likes the way resentment gathers dust. Quietly, relentlessly. Grace's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. One notification, then another. She glanced at it through the screen door but didn't pick it up. The night air was cool and carried the faint scent of wet earth. She folded her arms, staring out at the street where the snow was finally gone, where everything looked washed new again. Inside, the phone kept vibrating, the glow pulsing against the wall like a heartbeat. Grace whispered into the dark, not bitterly, not triumphantly, just certain. Let them talk. She turned off the porch light, one bulb at a time, until only the soft reflection of the string lights remained. And in that fragile quiet, beneath the hum of distant traffic and unseen voices, she felt it again, that calm, deliberate shift inside her. Not peace, not yet. Something sharper, something waiting. The rain came back to Missoula that Monday. Steady, soaking, the kind that made the gutters hum. Grace sat at her kitchen table with the red folder spread open before her, every document neatly aligned, every number circled in blue ink. The air smelled faintly of rain on wood and the coffee cooling beside her. She'd never been one for grand gestures, but this was arithmetic with consequence. On a lined pad, she began to write, home equity, three $10,000 savings account, $82,400 retirement annuity, $68,200 car, jewelry, personal assets, $6,500. She totaled it and stared at the figure, $467,300. She'd worked every shift, balanced every bill, pinched every unnecessary purchase to build that number. Her life's quiet proof, right there in ink. And now, every cent was going somewhere Nathan couldn't touch. Grace underlined the total once, twice, then capped her pen and set it down. Megan sat across from her, sorting through envelopes. You really want to keep everything printed? She asked, amused. Grace smiled faintly. I trust paper more than promises. Megan nodded, stacking each statement into piles. You're organized. I don't think I've ever seen anyone this prepared. Grace glanced up. Preparation is just survival written neatly. They worked in silence for a while, the rain a low percussion outside the windows. Every so often, Megan would pause to read a date or a balance, eyes widening slightly. Finally, she asked, Do you ever feel bad? About cutting them off completely? Grace didn't look up. Do you feel bad about locking your front door at night? Megan hesitated, then shook her head. No. Same thing, Grace said simply. The phone rang. A number Grace didn't recognize, but she knew. The area code was theirs. She let it ring until it clicked over to voicemail. A moment later, the sound of Amanda's voice filled the room, smooth and brittle as glass. Grace, she began, with a sigh dressed as sincerity. Could we talk? Just us women? You're making everything harder than it needs to be. Maybe we can still fix this. Grace reached out, pressed the red button, and ended the message mid-sentence. "My name's not a dial tone," she muttered. Megan smiled despite herself. "You really don't miss a beat." Grace gathered the papers, slid them back into the red folder, and closed it with care. "I just got tired of repeating one." 2 days later, Grace stopped by the credit union again. The rain had gone, leaving the streets slick and bright under a shy sun. Ellie Coates greeted her with a nod from behind the counter, her glasses catching the light. "Got your letter," Ellie said, standing as Grace approached her desk. "I've added it to your file." Grace arched an eyebrow. "And you read it?" Ellie smiled faintly. "Every word." She held up a copy in its clear sleeve. The top line, written in Grace's tidy script, read, "Under no circumstances family to be granted access, inquiry, or authorization without my direct consent." At the bottom, Ellie had stamped it. "Received and filed." "Consider it sealed," Ellie said. Grace exhaled, something loosening in her shoulders. "You're a good ally." Ellie chuckled softly. "I prefer enforcer." The two women shared a brief conspiratorial silence before Ellie leaned forward, her voice lowering. "He's been calling here, you know, trying to check balances. Says he's worried about you." Grace's expression didn't flicker. "Tell him not to be." "I already did." Grace nodded once. "Thank you." Ellie tapped the file folder on her desk, crisp and final. "It's a strange kind of freedom, isn't it? Watching people realize you don't need them." Grace's lips curved. "It's the most expensive kind." That evening, back home, the rain started again. Soft at first, then steady, beating gently against the window glass. Grace sat with her ledger still open, one hand resting on the edge of the table. The total stared back at her, neat and absolute. She thought of her husband, gone 20 years now, and how he'd always said money wasn't about control. It was about choice. For the first time, she understood what he meant. Her phone buzzed once, lighting the table in pale blue. "Nathan, we'll find another way. You'll see." Grace read it once, then deleted it without reply. Outside, the rain hit harder, drumming steady against the roof. She took her pen, drew one clean line through the total, and wrote beneath it in calm, deliberate strokes. Not theirs, not ever. Then she closed the folder and turned off the lamp. For a heartbeat, the room was completely dark, until lightning flashed outside, catching the faint gold embossing of her name on the folder's cover. Grace stared at it, that gleam of ownership, and whispered to herself, "They'll learn what loss really costs." And the thunder that followed sounded almost like applause. The first hint of spring came in the form of slush, snowmelt running like silver veins down the curbs, the smell of thawed pine drifting in from the mountains. Grace stood outside the glass doors of the Missoula Credit Union, her red folder tucked beneath one arm, and stared at her faint reflection in the door. For a woman who'd spent 70 years surviving other people's plans, today was the first time she'd walked in with one of her own. Inside, the air hummed with quiet purpose, printers, whispers, the low click of keyboards. Ellie looked up from her desk and smiled the kind of smile that carried recognition. "You're early," she said. "Habit," Grace replied. "I'm here to open a new account. Something with longevity." Ellie gestured toward her office, glass walls reflecting the pale light. "Come on in. Let's make it official." Grace followed, setting the red folder on the desk between them. Ellie flipped to a clean page on her pad. "What kind of account are we talking about?" Grace's voice was steady. "A college trust, for my granddaughter. Full funding, locked under my terms. I want her name on it, but I'll need a secondary trustee. Someone reliable." Ellie smiled. "I can think of one." "I was hoping you'd say that," Grace said. Ellie blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Me?" Grace nodded. You understand boundaries, and you know where the bodies are buried, financially speaking. Ellie laughed softly. You make me sound dangerous. You are, Grace said, lips curving slightly. That's why I trust you. Ellie began typing, her fingers sure on the keys. All right, how much are we talking? Grace slid a check across the desk. 460,000, give or take. Ellie froze mid-type, then looked up. Grace, that's everything. I know. There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation, just the kind of certainty that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Ellie adjusted her glasses. You realize this will be irrevocable once the trust is finalized? Grace folded her hands neatly. That's the idea. When Ellie printed the preliminary documents, the paper came out warm, smelling faintly of toner and inevitability. Grace signed each line without pause. Ellie watched, expression unreadable but eyes softening as she pressed her notary seal into the corner. Secondary trustee, Ellie said quietly, writing her own name beneath the title. It's an honor. It's insurance, Grace replied, but her tone carried affection. For both of us. 2 hours later, Megan arrived straight from school, backpack slung over her shoulder, hair damp from the drizzle outside. Grace was waiting at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of cocoa steaming between them. Got a minute? Grace asked. Always, Megan said, dropping her backpack and sliding into the chair. What's going on? Grace handed her an envelope, thick and crisp, the edges embossed with the credit union's logo. Open it. Megan frowned but did as told. Inside was a single page, a statement with her own name printed at the top, in bold. Beneficiary: Megan Halston Trust. Initial deposit: $460,000. Trustee: Grace Halston. Secondary trustee: Ellie Coates. Her mouth fell open. Grandma, what is this? The future, Grace said simply. Megan blinked hard, eyes glistening. You didn't have to. I did. Grace reached across the table, her hand warm and steady over Megan's. It's yours, because you never slammed the door on me. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain outside whispered against the window, soft and constant. Megan's tears fell soundlessly onto the page, the ink beginning to blur where they landed. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Grace smiled faintly. Then don't. Just do something worthy of it. The next day, Lou met her at the diner on Higgins Avenue, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and the world's strongest coffee. He slid into the seat across from her, hat tipped back, eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job nearly done. So, he said, you went through with it. I did, Grace replied, stirring her coffee. Every last cent. He nodded, pulling a folder from his briefcase. A new one, blue this time. Final paperwork. Once you sign these, it's officially filed under state trust law. No contest, no clawback. Not even your son could unravel it. Grace flipped to the last page, pen poised. Good. Lou smiled faintly. I'll have to start charging you for making my week more interesting. She chuckled, signing her name with that same practiced care. You wouldn't dare. You enjoy this too much. He gathered the signed pages, tapping them into alignment. There it is. Legal, binding, bulletproof. Grace reached for her purse, pulling out a small envelope sealed in red wax. She slid it across the table. That's for you. Lou frowned. Grace. It's not money, she said. It's a copy of my thank you letter. I wanted it in your file. A reminder that not every family disappoints. Lou looked at her for a long moment before tucking it carefully into his case. You know, for a woman who claims she's done fighting, you still play like a strategist. Grace smiled, watching the rain run down the diner window in silver threads. That's because the war's over, Lou. He leaned back, satisfied. And you won. Grace's gaze drifted toward the street, where people hurried under umbrellas, unaware of the storm she'd already weathered. "No," she said softly. "I just changed the rules." The bell above the door jingled as they stood to leave. Lou lingered for a moment, his tone turning quiet. "Everything's in order then. Nothing left to fear." Grace nodded, pulling on her gloves. Not even him. As they stepped into the drizzle, the neon glow from the diner's sign reflected off the wet pavement, throwing red and gold across the sidewalk. Grace tilted her face toward the light, the faintest smile touching her lips. Behind her, Lou's voice carried through the mist. "You're sure you're done?" Grace turned back once, her umbrella unopened, her hair damp with rain. "I'm never done," she said. "Just finished with the wrong people." She walked away down the slick sidewalk, each step deliberate, the city lights catching on puddles around her like small fragments of gold. And somewhere behind her, in a tidy office drawer, the trust documents waited, sealed, notarized, and unbreakable. The kind of legacy that money couldn't buy, the kind that said, "I was never yours to underestimate." The sun sat low over Missoula, throwing long golden lines through the lace curtains. Grace sat at her dining table for what she knew would be the last time she used it for work. The red folder, creased now from months of handling, lay open in front of her, the final checklist neatly typed. Each line had a box beside it, and each box had a mark. House deed transfer, complete. Trust finalized, filed, and confirmed. Power of attorney, revoked. Emergency contacts, updated. Letter to Megan, sealed. All that was left was to file it away. Grace slid the completed pages into a new manila folder. Across the front, in the same careful handwriting she'd used on every label since her days at the DMV, she wrote 2 words in black ink. No compromise. She held it there for a moment, fingers pressing lightly against the paper. Then she rose, walked to the cabinet by the window, and placed it in the drawer beside her husband's old watch and a small stack of photo albums. The drawer closed with a quiet click, firm, final. She stood for a moment in the hush that followed, her reflection faint in the glass. Around her, the house felt still, not empty, not lonely, just complete. When she turned toward the hallway, the late afternoon light followed her, pooling across the floorboards. She moved through each room the way she once did when company was coming, checking details, straightening small things no one else would notice. In the kitchen, she ran her fingers along the counter she'd scrubbed 1,000 times. In the living room, she straightened the frame that held her favorite photo of Megan, 17, laughing, wind in her hair. At the front door, she paused. The brass handle gleamed faintly in the light, reflecting her face back in miniature. She smiled at the sight of it, the same handle her son had once slammed in anger years ago, back when words were weapons and apologies were rationed. This time, she turned it gently and stepped outside. Her car waited in the driveway, clean and quiet. She walked to it slowly, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes, the air cool and edged with spring. When she reached the driver's door, she rested her hand on the handle, taking a long breath before she opened it. No slamming, no haste, just intention. The door swung open smooth as silk. She slid into the seat, the leather cool against her palm. For a moment she simply sat there, the engine off, the silence filling every corner. A tap at the window startled her. Megan stood there smiling softly, 2 takeout cups in hand. "Going somewhere without me?" she teased. Grace smiled. "Not a chance." Megan rounded the car, climbed into the passenger seat, and handed her one of the cups. "Tea. I figured you'd had enough coffee for one lifetime." Grace chuckled, starting the engine. "You might be right." They drove through town with the windows cracked, the scent of pine and damp pavement drifting in. The roads were almost empty, just a few cars heading the other way. The mountains ahead looked endless, their peaks still dusted with snow. When they reached the lake, the sun was melting behind the hills, turning the water bronze. Grace parked near the overlook, the same spot she'd driven to alone weeks before. They got out, cups in hand, the air cool and clear around them. Ducks skimmed the surface of the water, leaving perfect ripples in their wake. Megan glanced at her. "You did it, didn't you? Everything's done?" Grace nodded, eyes on the horizon. Every line checked, every lock changed. Megan smiled faintly. Grandpa would be proud. Grace's voice softened. He'd say it took me long enough. They stood there for a while, watching the light fade from gold to gray. Then Grace set her cup on the car roof and turned toward her granddaughter, her expression calm but fierce. "You know," she said quietly, "he shut me out for years, with words, with neglect, with indifference. But I finally realized, doors go both ways." Megan's gaze met hers, steady. "You shut him out too." Grace nodded once. "No," she said, her tone sharp as the air around them. "I shut him down." A long silence followed, the kind that carries weight but not regret. The sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving only the reflection of the sky on the lake, a deep, endless silver. Grace turned back to the car, opened the door with care, and sat behind the wheel. Her hand lingered on the handle for a beat, thumb brushing over the metal. She looked at Megan through the open window and said the words that had waited inside her for months, the truth that had been shaping itself with every step of her quiet revenge. "My son slammed the car door on me, so I slammed the door on his inheritance." Megan exhaled softly, a small smile crossing her face. "Good," she said. "He had it coming." Grace's laughter rose warm and light against the cool air. She turned the key, the engine humming steady beneath her hands. As they pulled away, the lake reflected the last streaks of fading sunlight. Two figures driving toward what came next. The past closing softly behind them like a door that no longer needed to be opened.